Judy Semroc currently works in the National Natural Areas Division for the Cleveland Museum of Natural History as a conservation specialist. She has co-authored 2 natural history guides, Dragonflies and Damselflies of Northeast Ohio and Goldenrods of Northeast Ohio, a field guide to identification and natural history. As a former petroleum geologist and science teacher, Judy loves to learn about and share her passion for the natural world through hikes, interpretive programs, and photography. So with that, I will go ahead and let you take it away, Judy.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Saw a couple of names on the hello list that I haven't seen for a while. Carrie, hello, how are you? And so many other friends that I haven't been able to see for a variety of reasons. But spring is coming, so we should time to get out and about. So I was asked to do this program and not to address the bees because the bees were being addressed in other programs. So this is going to be somewhat of a bee-less talk. There will be a couple of shots of bees in here, but I'm going to focus on the other types of pollinators, what they need, what you can do, how you can add to what you're currently doing. So to start off with this the beginning shot, these are one of these shots you get that something flies in right when you're taking something else, and it actually turned out to be somewhat in focus, so I was pretty happy about that. But these are 2 great spangled fritillaries, and they're on a dog bane, which is similar in of sorts to a milkweed as far as having sap within their system and having white flowers. So it's a plant to keep an eye out when you're out in nature and you find dogbane. There's a lot of little insects that will use that. So let's start off with a little bit of biology definition so that we're all talking about the same things. The nectar is the sugary secretion that a plant uses to attract the insects or the birds that can potentially ultimately pollinate for to get more flowers and to get seeds and all that whole process. And then the pollen is the fertilizing element of the flowering plants, which consists of a fine powdery, usually yellowish or pale cream colors, grains or spores, and sometimes they're in masses. And we'll see a lot of pictures of pollen on all kinds of things during this presentation. But as far as the economics are concerned with pollination, and I'm sure you've seen the statistic in probably every pollinator talk you've seen, but 1 out of every 4 mouthfuls of food and beverage that we consume requires the presence of a pollinator. And without pollinators, we wouldn't have apples, pumpkins, blueberries, and many other fruits and vegetables that normally would be on our menu. And then without pollinators, the flowering plants that we know and love would be history. So it is very important that we try to sort of change what we've been doing in the past with acres and acres of mowed grass that really don't provide any useful habitat for pollinators. So we're going to just talk about a bunch of different things we can do to make it better. So when we look at a flower, and I know this is taking you back to probably middle school or high school biology. Kids are probably doing all this on Zoom in their in their student classes, but so the dust-like pollen grains are produced in the anther, and as you can see here, if you can see my arrow, here's the anther here, which is the swollen tip of the stamen. The stamen is the whole, so the anther is attached to the filament, and that whole piece then is part of the stamen. And then, in order for a flower to be fertilized and a seed to be produced, pollen must be transferred from the anther to the stigma. So, if we look in this lower picture, this is a wild geranium flower, and you can see the pollen grains on the anther. Those are the yellow grains. And then the stigma, which is this middle portion of the flower, needs to have that pollen be transferred from this, not from necessarily this anther, but pollen from another anther of the same species of flower to the opening through that stigma, and then it would go down through the style and then the ovules in the
Judy, I'm going to interrupt you for
yes.
just a moment. Someone asked if you can turn your volume up anymore so that
Oh, okay. I think I'm up as far as I can go. I'm on this little. Is that any better?
it doesn't sound any different.
Yeah, I think I'm up all the way on this. Is that any better or is that lower? Is any difference?
No, not too much of a difference.
Okay.
Uh,
Doggone.
if the microphone's any closer, does that make a difference?
Well, let's try it. Is that better?
Oh, yeah, that's better.
Okay, good. Excellent. Thank
Awesome.
you.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, and then so pollen is transferred when the insects that attempt to sip from the nectaries. The nectaries are down here at the base of the flower. Same thing with all of these, and we'll talk more about the nectaries as we go through. That then, as they go into sip from the nectaries, then they can get pollen on their bodies, on their hairs, on their feet, on their feathers. For example, it's a hummingbird. And then when they go to the next flower, then that pollen can be transferred to that stigma, which begins the process. And then that pollen grain that is on the stigma then germinates, uh, sends a pollen tube carrying two male sperm downward to the ovary. And you could see the ovary here in this upper picture down here. And then the when the one sperm enters the egg, which produces a seed, the other sperm creates the endosperm, which is the tissue that surrounds the seed, which then feeds the seed nutrients. So that's sort of the quick and dirty of the process and gives you sort of an idea. I wanted to add this piece to it. So, for example, we know about our lilies and that. Turk's cap lily is one of our native lilies. And it just turns out to be one of those plants where the pollen out here on the ends. You can see your stigma coming up through the middle. But as you can see the flower in nature, where the pollen is normally out and about or out front, because the plant wants those pollinators to come in and rub against that. If they hide the areas where the pollen is found to where the insects can't get to it and get it on their bodies, then they're not doing themselves any favors. So, for example, the Turk's cap lily, the nectaries are way up in here, and since it's not a flower that faces downward, the pollinators have to get their little tongue up in there while they can rub on the body here, all of the pollen that's on here. They need to get their tongues up in here in order to sip from their nectaries. So by basically forcing those insects or the hummingbirds to get way down into this end, then it's allowing that pollen that you see here to get onto their bodies. And here's that stamen with some pollen already out at the end. So we know that for Turk's cap lily and other lilies like that, the swallowtail butterflies and the ruby-throated hummingbirds are the major pollinators for this plant. And it's all about sort of the geography of where everything's located on the plant. Okay, one of the more important things about how things get pollinated and who can pollinate it is the shape of the flower. If you take a look at this, this may look familiar, or you may think this is too difficult to figure out what this is, but this is a buttonbush flower, greatly enlarged so that you can see how, these all stick up here, the nectaries are way down in here. So if you are an insect that's trying to get into this plant, you're going to brush against those parts. So then let's look at the what I call the shape of the stage on which pollinators perform. We have all different shapes of flowers, and we have all different locations of where the nectar is found. And as a result, we have a lot of different places where the pollen is found because the plant is trying to attract the highest number of pollinators. So that is the reason why its pollen is located in different places. So, for example, we have this viceroy butterfly on the purple coneflower. When it gets ready, the pollen is out front. You don't need a really long tongue to either get to the pollen. But again, your body, if you're an insect, is going to be down close so that you can pick up some of those pollen grains. This middle picture is one of our rarities. It's a fringed gentian, And the fringed gentian is one that is pollinated basically by the bumblebees because they need to force their way into this. This flower doesn't really open any more than what you see here. And with these little edges to it, which is a very pretty little plant, they're trying to get way down in here. And sometimes you'll be out, same thing with the turtle head, picture to the right. You might be out in nature and you hear a buzzing, but you can't find the bee. Typically, then they will be inside of this flower of the turtle head or this flower of the fringed gentian if you can find them. They're very rare. And again, they sometimes they will go in and they will actually chew a hole in the base of the flower so that they can go right to the nectar and bypass the lip that they need to climb into if they're doing it the regular way. You also have things like blue vervain, where the butterflies can stick their little tongues right down in where they need to be. The wild geranium here on the right, their nectar is actually out more accessible to smaller tongued insects, and their pollen is way out in front. Milkweeds, on the other hand, have a different way of being pollinated. So there's not a lot of insects that are able to pollinate. The little tiny insects that get into milkweed are not able to have the parts of the milkweed on their bodies because they're too small. So typically, milkweeds are pollinated more by the larger insects, typically bumblebees as well. So let's take a look at how a composite flower provides a lasting pollen supply. So here's a gray-headed coneflower. When it first opens, the photo on the left, you can see the petals are real skinny. The center part looks all green. As it opens, the petals flatten out more. They look a little bit wider. But what the plant does, and so this is all of our composites, so that's things like daisies and purple coneflower and those kinds of things. They start to open and produce their pollen on the lowest row closest to the petal when they first open. And then each day or each couple of days, you can actually watch this plant do this. The next row will open above it, and then the next row will open and it'll continue to open as time goes on. But you can see this bee is in here and it's going across all of these little open areas where the pollen you can see is on the tips. And then you can see how all the hairs of the body is picking up all this great amount of pollen. Well, the next day they can come right back out and the next row will be open, or the day after that, so that they aren't just opening and giving off all of their pollen in one day, because any of the insect visitors could potentially take all of that pollen, at one time. So by spacing it out, it really makes for a good system to be able to attract a lot of different insects for a longer period of time to be able to pick up that pollen and then move on to the next flower. So then let's look at some insect pollen anatomy. This is a regal fritillary butterfly. Of course, it's no longer being found in Ohio where it used to be found in Ohio. This shot was taken in Indiana. There's a couple sites in Indiana, a couple sites in Illinois. But again, with that tongue, you can really see that that's one of our main parts of their anatomy that needs to help them to be pollinators or even to get the nectar. So, our effective tools for pollination are a strong tongue, a sturdy set of legs, and hairy bodies. So, here's our bumblebee. This bumblebees are considered bees that are long-tongued bees. So, you can see the tongue here. They're going into the flower again, trying to get as much of the nectar as they can get. But you can see on this flower, the pollen is like a pale cream color or white. And you can see that already the antenna, the eyes, the legs have already picked up some of that pollen. Over here, this is another type of bee that its little tongue has these little grabbers on the end. And so when they stick that into the flower, they're able to drag that sort of L-shaped tongue along the inside of the plant to either pick up pollen, pick up nectar. And again, you can see it's already visited a plant because you can see all this pollen on the face. So a strong tongue of a variety of different creatures is very important. Here's our yellow-collared scape moth on the left and our mourning cloak on the right. So for example, the moth on the left is sticking its little tongue down into, this is one of our mountain mints early in the morning, so it still has all of its dew on it. But if you look at the tongue on the morning cloak, you can see that in the red, you can see that that tongue is in two pieces. What that's telling you is that that morning cloak has very recently hatched out of its chrysalis. Because when they first hatch out, the tongue is in two pieces. And then as the day goes on or the time goes on, once they've hatched out, the tongue then fuses together and makes one straw-like adaptation. At this point, a couple hours from now, this tongue will look totally as one piece as it looks like over here. But this, if you see this when you're out and about and you're looking at your insects, especially with the butterflies and the moths, you will, if you find that that tongue has already started to fuse back by the face and it's gotten to a little over halfway, then that tells you that that butterfly has recently hatched out. Okay, and then hairy legs and hairy bodies. You can find a lot of different insects that are working plants pretty hard. The flower longhorn beetles are a whole group of beetles that spend most of their time on the flowers. And you can see all the pollen that is being captured by the hairs and all the features of the body. These little guys over here, these weevil-like beetles, there are weevils, and then there are true weevils, and then there are beetles that look like weevils. True weevils have a little kink in their antenna that looks like a little elbow. There are other beetles or there are other weevils that are not true weevils, but you can see they have this long snout. And if you could see the snout on the female, they're in the mating position. This is the female, this is the male on top. But you could see her snout is actually making a line in this plant stem. Uh, they feed on a variety of things. They also lay their eggs in a variety of ways, but you could see all of the pollen grains that have already been picked up on their bodies, depending on where they were. And they just then, as they move from plant to plant, that's how that pollen gets distributed. And then that's the next part of the way that pollination takes place. So here's our hummingbird sphinx moth coming into the monarda. It's starting to unravel its tongue because it's seeing a meal in its future. So it's like getting out the knife and the fork and the spoon, and it's time to get to work. So our gallery of important insect pollinators, we have bees, beetles, flies, wasps, butterflies, and moths. And we're going to talk about each of these different categories in different ways so that we can see all of what they do. So for the beetles, their preferred flowers are usually large, flat, or bowl shaped with ample, easy, accessible pollen because most beetles do not have very long tongues or very long facial features where they can get in there and get pollen that is deeper into the plant. The flowers might be solitary or in clusters of smaller flowers. Sometimes there's an odor, which some people think are unpleasant for plants that are pollinated by beetles, but sometimes they can be strongly fruity or fetid. Some of the examples of plants that beetles will be attracted to: rose, spirea, asters, sunflower, clethra, goldenrod, winged sumac, pond lilies, trout lilies, spice bush, calycanthus, and buttonbush. And then examples of trees that are pollinated by beetles include pawpaw, magnolia, and tulip. The blue oval that you see in the upper right picture is showing you where pollen has either been eaten or transferred to the body hairs of insect visitors. So you can see how part of that looks like it's bare and other parts look like there's still pollen. But you can also tell by the petals when you start to see the little brown dots or that the petal isn't fully open, that the plant is starting to die back. So their pollen should be being taken up by the insects that are visiting it. Other
Judy, this
beetles.
is a good chance for a great question that Kathy submitted. Since a lot of different flowers are going after maybe one species, what prevents a pollen from one species from pollinating another species?
Well, usually what happens is if they're visiting other flowers on that same plant, then they're able to transfer that pollen. If they go to another plant, part of the anatomy of the plant doesn't necessarily accept other types of pollen grains. However, that's how sometimes they will take different pollen with little brushes and take it from one plant to another to make some of their crosses that they make. So that kind of thing is done as well. That's a great question, but a lot of that has to do with the opening in the anatomy of the plant to be able to accept different types or only their own type of pollen grain. And that, for example, works well with, for example, on the milkweeds, where the little flanges that get picked up on the legs of the insects, where that fits in their little stigma is only open for a certain amount of time. So that has to get there in that amount of time in order for that to make it actually pollinate. So yeah, that's a great question because they're traveling from plant to plant, flower to flower. And if most of you being the gardeners that you are, you have a whole bunch of plants in one area, and many of these insects are going to visit a lot of those different plants. So part of it is the acceptability of that grain of pollen into that anatomy of that plant. Thank you for the question. That was good. So again, we have our blister beetles, we have locust borers, we have our click beetles. And remember, not all of our pollinators are native insect species. We know that we've got a lot of stuff that have come in from, different places, and we consider them a non-native insect, but they still can perform, pollinating services because as they move from plant to plant, flower to flower, and have pollen grains on their body, they can perform that service as well. One thing that we think about or that we learn a lot and know a lot about are ladybugs and our natives and our non-natives. Our spotted lady beetles come out early in the spring, and they're ones that if you've got access to Spring Beauty, that is one that I highly recommend. It's quite the show. So as Spring Beauty comes up early and the spotted lady beetles come out early, sometimes you will find 10 to 30 spotted lady beetles just totally devouring the nectar on these spring beauties. And again, the nectar is way down here in this yellow section, but the pollen is out here on the ends of the where you see these little pink parts. And the lines that you see, those are called nectar trails. Remember that insects see in UV light, so it's kind of like a lit up Eat It Joe's sign. These are pointing to the insect to come down into the lower center part of that flower to get to the nectar. And by doing that, that then allows the body of that insect to pass over the pollen and pick it up. Same thing over here on the right. There's a dogbane leaf beetle, which typically is eating the actual plant foliage, but they are also good nectar eaters and they will climb. Here's again, you can see those nectar trails inside of the penstemon because the penstemon, in order to give up its nectar, it's way down here. So the insect is either going to have to crawl inside that flower or force its way inside that flower to get to the nectar. But again, the pollen is out much closer to the opening so that it makes it easy for the insect to pick up that pollen and carry it to the next flower. So let's talk about our flies. We typically think of flies as being very bothersome, but however, there's quite a few species that are very excellent pollinators. They prefer dull or pale green or white or meat dark brown or cream colored flowers. The flower shapes usually are a funnel or a bowl shaped. The fly pollinated flowers may have a noticeable odor. Again, because sometimes some of the fly pollinators that actually are used in these sort of meat colored flowers actually come up from the ground. So a lot of times, if you're familiar, the American ginger flower points downward towards the soil. The same thing with the pawpaw tree flowers, they point downward. And the idea is they are trying to attract the flies that come up out of the soil to be noticing either their scent or their color and drawing them in to be able to pollinate their flowers. The species include bee flies, syrphid flies, which are also called flower flies, tachinid flies or tachinid flies, horse flies, and deer flies. The bee fly, which you see up here in the upper left, it's beating its wings so fast that you don't actually see the wings, but they're out here to the side. They have this long little proboscis. It is not a stinger. It is actually its anatomy that is allowing it to go down into this bluet, get the nectar that's way down here. But again, the pollen is out front where it will rub on their hairy little bodies to take it to the next level. Now, the immature bee flies are parasitic, and the adults only drink nectar. So while they're drinking the nectar out of this quaking lady, they are also able to pick up the pollen on their bodies. This picture to the upper right is a male mosquito. Now, they have this really cool tongue that they extract their tongue. They open these little flanges that you see on the side. So they stick their tongue down into the flower. This photo was taken at night because this is typically when they're doing all their pollinating work or their nectar gathering work. And they stick their tongue down into the flower and then they open these little flanges, kind of like an aileron on an airplane. They open these flanges and then they pull their tongue back out so that the flanges are actually picking up nectar from inside of the flower. And then that nectar goes into the sperm packet that then the male mosquito will pass on to the female. She's in charge of biting us, and he's in charge of gathering all the nectar and other food that will then go into that sperm packet that then gets passed on to the female. So some of our other pollinating, and I use pollinating and nectaring together because they're not always pollinating, but most of the time they're always trying to gather nectar. So we have our tachinid fly. Many species are out there. Here's another one. Again, a lot of hairs on this part of their body that they can pick up. Some of them have these little feather-like projections on their legs that can also pick up pollen. Here we have a flower fly or a syrphid fly that tend to look like bee or wasp mimics. Now, remember, these are really small. And when you're small like that, you get eaten by other things. So by mimicking a bee or a wasp, you tend to more often get left alone because they aren't quite sure. But if you're trying to tell the difference between flies and bees and wasps, remember flies have really, really tiny antennae. They look like little flaps out in the front of their head, so they're really small. Bees and wasps have much larger and longer antennae. And here's another flower fly, another syrphid fly that's a bee mimic that'll just crawl over the top. And here, again, you can see how on the inside, all of the pollen has already been opened up out here so that the grains are available. But if you can see on the inside where the openings haven't totally opened enough to give off the pollen. So that being what a composite, that's what we talked about earlier. Other variety of fly species. Here's a soldier fly. They typically are eating things in the leaf litter, but they will crawl across the top of plants trying to get to nectar. Another syrphid fly here. Here's that bee fly with the wings not beating. So you can see it's on a colt's foot, and the colt's foot's opening up to where the nectar and pollen are available. And again, with this hairy body, it's able to pick that up. And then here's another syrphid fly that's a bee mimic that, again, is trying to get to the nectar and, of course, then picking up the pollen. Okay, wasps. I know we don't all plant our gardens so that we're inviting wasps to come. So, with that said, wasps are less efficient as a pollinator. They are mostly visiting the flowers for nectar. Some of the wasps can look like bees, but they do not possess the body hairs that bees typically have. And so they don't necessarily pick up very much pollen because their bodies are very smooth. And so they're not able to transfer as much because they're not picking up as much. So that makes them a less efficient pollinator. They do prefer flower shapes that are usually a broad platform or a heavier flower because they are a heavier bodied insect. And sometimes when you see them, they'll be walking across the top of the flower. For example, in the upper right, you see that Queen Anne's lace, and that'll just keep walking across while it's trying to obtain some nectar. So Queen Anne's lace, the mountain mints, dotted horsemint, buttonbush, some of our tree flowers are ones that they will look for nectar on, milkweeds and goldenrods. And then again, in this lower picture, you see a wasp working the blueberry flowers. They can stick their head down in. They probably can't totally reach where the nectar is, which is way down here, but they may be able to get some pollen on their antenna and such, and then potentially pass it on. So these are ichneumanoids, paper wasps, yellow jackets, bald-faced hornets, thread-waisted wasps are the ones that we most often see crawling around on the tops of the flowers. Our butterflies. This is the one that I think most people are trying to attract as far as a pollinator group because they love the colors. They love seeing them come through their yard. So again, they like the brightly colors, the reds, the oranges, pinks, blues, purples. And usually they're often large or they're showy. They may have a faint fragrance. uh, they will also feed on sap or feces or dead animals. So, for example, here's a tawny emperor here that isn't so much a pollinator of or pollinator in regard to pollen, but it does. You might find them on the sides of trunks, for example, of apple trees or cherry trees where sap is being exuded. Our harvester butterfly. This is one that also can feed on sap. It can feed on it's more of a butterfly that you won't see crawling across the top of a flower, but they are sap eaters. So if you're looking for species like this, their food choice tells you this is where I should look for them. You won't necessarily find them on a flower. The other parts that we know, for example, here's our liatris that has this long tubular flower. Butterflies and moths have those long, skinny little, straw-like tongues that allows them to get into the base of the flower so that they can get to the nectar, having those hairy bodies with the overlapping cells on their wings picks up a lot of nectar to carry on as they go forward. So zinnias, goldenrods, asters, yarrow, there's, countless plants that work for them. Liatris, butterfly weed, coneflower, all of those are ones that they can absolutely feed from. They can hang upside down. So any of those plants, flowers that are pointing downward, they're able to get their tongue up in there and get to that nectar. And again, also you want to provide the plants that they will lay their eggs on, which will give you the full life cycle potentially in your yard. So if you have the food that they know that they can lay their eggs on for their caterpillars, then for example, here's our black swallowtail larva feeding on a Queen Anne's lace. The female laid the eggs on the Queen Anne's lace. They hatched, the caterpillars fed on it and continued their life cycle throughout on that plant. So that's something else to add to your repertoire of plants. So not only are you attracting them as pollinators, but if you get the whole life cycle going, that's very good. And I could give you, 100 shots of 100 different butterflies that are nectaring on plants, but I'm choosing a few of these. Some of these you don't see as often. A common checkered skipper on an aster or painted lady is one we see, but you can see the bumblebee down here. We know she's a female because she's got her little patch going here. But again, the plants make a big difference, but so do some of the other items that you could have in your yard: water, sand for those that puddle, things like that. And again, here's zebra swallowtail on orange butterfly weed, red spotted purple on purple coneflower, and an orange sulfur. You could see that long tongue going down into the clover. I can't say enough about some of these species of plants that most people consider weeds, but pink clover is one of the best. Most of these shots are taken in my yard because I have a yard full of clover. I do not spray my grass. I don't have much grass. I've planted all kinds of things, or I've let my grass grow up and all kinds of things came up as a result. So it's great to see these insects because a lot of these plants, like pink clover, has been naturalized. It's been here a long time. Same thing with dandelions. Dandelions is one of the first plants that our early butterflies or early moths can actually get nectar from because it's the only one that's open that early. So a lot of people will rush out and spray all their dandelions, but in fact, they could actually be having a lot of butterflies and moths visiting that plant if they leave it alone. Um, so our moths, we have nocturnal species and we have then our day flying species. The nocturnal species typically visit pale or dull colored flowers that open in the late afternoon or at night, and they can emit a strong or sweet odor. I want to work on a PowerPoint that's talking about the plants to plant to have a moon garden, and I don't mean a moon garden as in by the phases of the moon, but a moon garden. So when you're outside and want to smell these really great plants that open up at night because their moths that pollinate them only come out at night, that's how they keep their resources in check. So if you're a plant that is only pollinated by a moth that comes out at night, there's no point in you blooming during the day. So, or providing pollen or nectar during the day. The idea is to provide your resources when the insect that can pollinate you can actually get to those resources. And then our day flying species will again visit the brighter colored flowers, yellows, bright whites, large and showy, again, tubular with deeply hidden, abundant nectar, but sometimes limited pollen. So they need those insects to come in and get whatever pollen they can, even if they don't produce a lot of pollen. And then the flowers may form clusters that also can provide a landing platform because you'll find that the moths will crawl over the top um, because they're not necessarily ones that are going to consistently beat their wings to keep them back from the flower. And we'll see that here with our sphinx moths. So some of the examples that are good for them: phlox, goldenrod, evening primrose, again, back to the monardas or the mints, penstemon, buttonbush, and more. Here's our little forester moth with the honeybee coming in on that buttonbush. As a shrub, that's probably one of the best that you could plant to bring in a variety of pollinators. And it doesn't necessarily need to be in a wet location, although you may see them out in nature in wetlands or areas that have constant water. I have several button bushes in my yard that are not in those types of areas, and they do very well. Here's a goldenrod stowaway moth. These are moths that are out during the day. The Canadian Petrophylla. Again, goldenrod. Bidens can be another one. Even if you have pets that get the little stick tights in their fur, a lot of insects are uh, gravitated toward that type of flower. So here's our sphinx moths, our clearwing sphinx moths. We have two species. We have the snowberry clearwing and the hummingbird sphinx moth. Again, they will be able to take their tongue out, go down into the flower to get the nectar, and constantly be beating their wings. When they first hatch out, their wings have a lot of scales on them, especially on the outside. And then as they get older, some of the scales will fall off. So you'll see that there's more of a clear area to their wing. But again, that long tongue works great for getting nectar, but since they're not very often touching the flower, they don't pick up a lot of pollen. However, in this picture here, you see the tongue of the hummingbird sphinx moth. It was obviously on a flower that had nectar and pollen out front, and you could see the pollen on their tongue when they go to the next plant. They can actually transfer that, but you can see that really just sometimes their feet might be touching. So their body may not pick up a lot of nectar, but their tongues can. Then I have several of these that I call incidental pollination by unlikely pollinators. And these are insects that will hang out on plants not for the reason of nectaring or pollinating, but more of the reason of eating the nectar seekers and the pollen seekers. So on the left, we have our ambush bug that hides, for example, on purple coneflower. Here you can see where the nectar's down low in here, but you can see how it opens this little star-shaped part of the plant, and here's where the pollen is. So as it sits and hides in that plant, it can actually pick up pollen on its parts again, and then it can capture something that's coming in to get the nectar or the pollen. This shot in the upper right, I love this shot from my friend Jonathan White. I just love the way that as the katydid, which comes in to also can get nectar, but it also can actually eat part of the petal, and you can see some where it's discolored here. Katydids are great for eating parts of plants, but you can see that as it's walked around the inside of this flower, it has picked up the pollen because the pollen's way out here. And so that's another one that where katydids aren't really thought of being pollinators, they can actually serve as pollinators because of the way that they work the plants for other reasons. And then down here we have this arrowhead spike-tailed dragonfly. And if you look in the blue circle, you can see that it's got pollen on its legs and on the front of its face. That happened to be a dragonfly that caught and ate a bumblebee. And the pollen that was on the bumblebee actually um, got onto the legs and onto the mouth parts of the dragonfly. So if it goes on and lands on another plant, it could potentially transfer some pollen, but it is not one of those species that is a heavy hitter in the pollinator department. Also, we've got the goldenrod crab spider where it'll sit in the center of the plant. It's another predator that is waiting, but you can see how it's got its web strung through here, and the pollen from this daisy has gotten onto the webbing. So even if an insect comes in there, even if it gets captured, it's not going to serve any more purpose as a pollinator because it's going to be a meal. But again, this when this spider moves to another plant or another flower, for example, it can carry that pollen with them. You can see how all this pollen is on the bottom of the body and on the legs. And here's that daisy again, where you can see the pollen here on the outside rim, but in the center, those haven't opened up yet to show the pollen or to distribute the pollen to its little friends. Here's a lygus bug. Again, you can see all the pollen as it walks its way across the top of the goldenrod. And then our green lacewing, which is again another predator that can eat a lot of little things that we don't necessarily care for, aphids and such. But you can see it gets pollen on its wings, the bottom of its body, on its antenna. So again, these are all what I call unlikely pollinators, but they can do the job. So let's move to our hummingbird, which can then do some pollination as well. We all know that the hummingbirds like the scarlet, red, orange, or white tubular flowers. They also will hunt the tiny bugs, which visit the blooms. Since their bills are long and their tongues are grooved and flexible, they can reach a lot of food sources, including little insects and nectar that other insects either miss or can't reach. So, for example, when he's inside all the way here in his tongue. So let's look at one that isn't blocked by this part, but you can see that the nectar is way down here. And if the little bugs do get in here to feed on that nectar, when the hummingbird comes and sticks its tongue out, it actually can pick up those insects as well as the nectar inside of the plants. So 80% of hummingbirds' diet actually consists of small insects and spiders. So while it's good that you're putting out your feeders and you keep them clean and you keep them full, keep a good smattering of plant species at the base of those feeders or in your gardens, because then you are providing the potential for them to get their 80% of their diet from those insects and those spiders that might be visiting the other plants that you have in your gardens. Again, the flowers that are attractive to the hummingbirds are usually large and showy. Again, abundant nectar, lots of little bugs. If you've ever looked at a milkweed flower, a common milkweed flower, there's a lot of teeny little bugs that visit that flower, those multiple little flowers, and those hummingbirds are very much able to get all of them. Good plants for the hummingbirds are the columbine, fuchsias, honeysuckle, things in the sage family, cardinal flower, penstemon, bee balm, jewelweed, nasturtium, then native honeysuckle as well as non-native honeysuckle, and then milkweeds and salvias. Jewelweed in particular, if you have an area that's like a little forested area and you've got jewelweed, I can't say enough about that plant. It is native. We have yellow and the most people know the yellow, but we also have the white flowered as well. When you are in a forest or you're in a wetland area that might have jewelweed, you might hear the buzzing of the bumblebees that can climb into that to get into that nectar. But again, they reseed themselves every year. You really don't have to do much about it. Again, a wonderful, wonderful plant for hummingbirds. And then here's where I talked about the Turk's cap lily being one that the hummingbirds are part of the pollination process. So while she's sticking her little bill in there and the nectar is way down in here, the pollen here can rub off onto the feathers or even onto the wings. And as they then go to the next plant, they can do that. But again, it's difficult for some of the other insects to get in here to get nectar because then it requires them to be basically going against gravity or flying against gravity. They can crawl in there and walk in there, but those like a butterfly, the swallowtails have the bulk ability to, get in there and get to the nectar because they're a larger butterfly. Here's our little mistaken identity between our ruby-throated hummingbird and our hummingbird sphinx moth. I get a lot of questions about this. I'll get pictures and say, they'll send me a hummingbird sphinx moth and they'll say, look at this great hummingbird that I had on my flowers. So just take a look if you think it's a hummingbird. If it has antenna or it has 6 legs, it is not a hummingbird. If it's got this long tongue that sticks out and goes down like that, it's not going to be a hummingbird because it needs to have its little bill. But again, they can be close in size. They continually beat their wings where it might be difficult to see their wings, but look for the legs, look for the antenna, and that will help you determine. All right, let's go into our pollinator garden planning. And again, all of these things that I mentioned here are also very important to the bees as well. So don't just think that these are just things for everything aside from bees. You want to do as much as you can in your area to provide as many different species as possible. Think shrubs, think trees, think annuals, because all of those are very important. Remember, some of our species of plants may only have a couple of insects that can pollinate them. And if they don't get those insects and don't get pollinated, then they're not going to be around very much longer. Use native species whenever possible because they're better adapted to our area climate, our other insects, disease immunity. Choose the true and classic varieties over the cultivars because a lot of the cosmetic breeding can lessen the fragrance or can change the color, which then can confuse or make pollinators not visit them at all. A lot of our pollinators are attracted to fragrance in plants, so it's good to have those true or classic varieties, native species, for that reason. You want to include plants whose blooms will peak at different times of the growing season. So, for example, those plants that come out in the spring and they are what we call spring ephemerals, they are out and blooming for a variety of reasons. Number one, a lot of the leaves aren't on the trees so that they can get their photosynthesis in because they can get more sun. But a lot of it has to do with the species that can pollinate them. They are not opening their flowers to an insect that doesn't come out until July, okay? Because those plants are going to be back underground. And if those pollinators were not out when their flowers were open, they're tough. They're out of luck. So different times of different blooms attract different types of pollinators that may be very specific to those plants. And then include plants that will be useful as both adult nectar sources and larval food sources, which means here is our black swallowtail again on a Queen Anne's lace. This is not a dead black swallowtail. That's just the skin that caterpillar crawled out of. And so it just remains there looking like a little deflated balloon of a caterpillar. And remember, with our caterpillars, when they move to their next instar, an instar is a stage from basically from their egg. Once they hatch out of their egg, the first thing you do is eat their egg for a number of reasons. One being for the protein in the egg, two being if they eat their egg, then the predatory insects that look for an open egg and therefore look for a caterpillar can't find them because the egg isn't there. But unlike us, when we gain weight or when we put on weight, we just go buy bigger clothes. The caterpillar grows to the size of the skin that they currently are in. And when they have then filled that skin and they need to move to the next instar, that skin will split down the back. They'll crawl out of it. They will have a new skin to fill. And hence, that's the gradations of their instars. And they just get longer with each ensuing instar. This is the one that it crawled out of. And then will start to eat again to fill the next instar of skin. Avoid excessive mowing. Get rid of as much grass as you can, or just leave those for pathways, because our insects need the dirt, they need the sand, they need bare ground, they need a lot of things that we don't provide if we have a yard full of grass. You want to aim for diversity. Additional benefits come from many interacting species. The more, the better. Here's one of our little sand wasps in action photo, digging its burrow and clearing out the sand. You can see the sand flying as he's kicking it with its hind legs. Here's a little stink bug prey that it will then carry down into its little tunnel when it gets done with it. It'll bring food in that way when it's laying its eggs. So again, this bare soil, bare sand can be very, very important to a lot of these species. So
Hmm.
you want to create these areas, sand, logs, rock piles, little crevices for soil and cavity nesting species, some of our native bees, some of our wasps. I know we don't want to set up areas where we think we're going to have a bunch of yellow jackets coming in and making nests, but uh, that's when you want to bring in your skunks. The skunks will eat every yellow jacket nest they can find, including climbing trees to get to them. For example, they will climb up to get to a hornet's nest. They will take apart a hornet's nest during the night and eat hornets out of there, eat their young, eat any of the little cells that have eggs in them. If you have a yellow jacket's nest and all of a sudden you come out and you find that it's been excavated, that's your friendly neighborhood skunk. Again, providing water is a big, big deal. Shallow water sources like you see in this photo, where you've got mud here, you've got a little drier mud here, a little bit drier mud here. Very important for the males of all of our butterfly species. The males are the ones that do what we call puddling. They take their little straw like tongue and they are basically picking up minerals from this wet sand, wet mud, um, the side of areas, where even into areas that's got moist soil there. They also will look for uh, scat. They will look for bird droppings. They will look for dead animals on the side of the road. All of this is all part of the recycling process of nature. While you might find them on a dead raccoon at the side of the road, it's because they're picking up the chemicals and the minerals that they put into their sperm packet to pass on to the female. So anytime you see puddling butterflies like this, just know that they're all males. Sorry, guys. It's not that you're doing anything gross or disturbing. You're just doing what you're supposed to do. And then available water is a must, especially at this time of year when a lot of our water sources are frozen because it's been below freezing for so long. Uh, put in a little bird bath heater or whatever in some sort of a pail or something that they can actually get to. You don't want it to be really deep because it's not like they can land on the water to drink. You want it to be a shallow area that they can actually get to, or put a rock inside of it. Also, consider leaving standing dead trees called snags for native pollinating insects to use as potential nest sites. 30% of our native bees use dead trees for for their egg laying and for their nesting. Remember, they only look dead 6 months out of the year, as trees always look bare in the winter. So consider planting dead trees, which I have done, or a dead branch that I've gotten off of a larger tree. I'll dig a hole, I'll put it in the ground, I'll hang my feeders from it, I'll let it fall apart so that, for example, some of our little brown snakes will crawl up under the bark. They're about the diameter of a pencil, if that. But it provides habitat for them to hide as they are eating ants and things like that, because they can get up under the bark, like you see here, that might slough off like that. It also provides areas where other insects, such as some of our butterflies that overwinter as adult butterflies, they can hide up underneath the bark of those dead trees. So it's really, really excellent habitat. And again, you can plant those dead trees and you can use them for a variety of uses. Here's an old tree trunk that's laying on the forest floor, but as it decomposes, you can see how it's been just riddled with openings, either from boring beetles. Woodpeckers will even find when they land on a tree, they can feel with their feet if there are insects or larvae that are inside of that, and they start to make their holes to get to them. That's why the emerald ash borer has been a boon to the woodpecker population, because the woodpeckers, when they land on the trees and the larvae are in the actual under the bark, they actually can feel that. They can start going into those D-shaped holes that the actual emerald ash borer makes when it goes to lay its egg inside of the tree. And the woodpeckers now, instead of having 1 to 3 eggs in a clutch, now they're having 3 to 7 eggs because there's just so much more food for them. So your Christmas bird counts have been probably very generous in woodpecker numbers as a result. Also encourage the late season flowering plants such as asters, goldenrods, and snakeroot because they provide much needed food sources for our migrating monarchs and other migrating species. Migrating dragonflies and insect hawking birds, such as the common nighthawks, feed off of insects that might be nectaring on those late season flowers. So, that circle of life is very important. For example, if there's a lot more insects out there than there are nighthawks, if they don't get food as they make their way onto migration. Same thing with the monarchs. If they don't get enough to fill up their stores of lipids before they get to Mexico, they may never get to Mexico. So you can be a little, sheets station along the way that can help out these monarchs and other species. So let's look at some of our plants that are going to be good ones for everything we're trying to do. Obviously, the milkweeds. There's a variety of milkweed species in Ohio. Some do better up north. Some we find others down further south in Ohio, but there's quite a few species that we typically see. And these are the three biggies: the common milkweed, swamp milkweed, and orange butterfly weed that we typically see here in the Northeast. But you could also have poke milkweed. You could have, some other ones that are out there that will grow here. Just, you might have to augment the habitat a little bit to make it for what they like. So you can try that as well. The mints, a lot of people choose not to plant mints because of their aggressive behavior. But if you have a whole flower bed that's filled with, red monarda or bee balm, the insects that you will get will just be stunning. The hummingbirds you will get they will be visiting constantly throughout the day. Especially if you have an area that's lawn grass, take it out, put in red monarda, let it spread. You will love it. A wild bergamot here on the left, and then this is an area that I have a bunch of mountain mint, both blunt leaved and narrow leaved, and then the wild bergamot together so that there's a variety there. And the bees that I have are just amazing. They love the mountain mints. So another one to do some research, see if you've got. I mean, it really doesn't need anything specific for the soil or anything where it grows. But if you have an area where you can let it go, I highly recommend that as a plant to use. Our asters, which typically bloom late, very important to our native bees, very important to those migrating monarchs. So this can be, these can all be good. This one I call it, just put in a little what I call a spotlight species. This is called prairie or azure blue sage, Salvia azurea. This is a plant that is naturalized to Ohio, but what I like about it is blue flowers in the latter part of our season. So it's blooming in September and October. It gets 3 to 4 feet tall. It likes dry soil or full sun. Again, the bees and the butterflies that will visit this, especially the monarchs, this is one that I have that I'm very happy with, and it's made it through all the winters. and done very well. So it's a great little plant. And again, the goldenrods, we talk a lot about the goldenrods because they have so many flowers on a given plant. While they might not have individual flowers, may not have a lot of nectar or pollen on one individual flower, they have so many flowers on one plant. And you can see all these buckeye butterflies that are just working this goldenrod, peck skipper, some of our halictid bees. I mean, there's just a lot of species will use goldenrod. So there are species that are aggressive and there are species that are not as aggressive. So you could do a little bit of research on that and find out which ones, might do better in a smaller garden habitat if you have just smaller areas that you are able to plant. And yes, goldenrods are wonderful, and no, they do not give us hay fever. um, their bad luck is the fact that they are blooming at the same time that ragweed is blooming. Now, ragweed, here's ragweed fully in flower. Ragweed is in the grass family. They are pollinated by the wind, which is why you sneeze from ragweed, because the wind is carrying the pollen. Goldenrod pollen is very heavy and very thick, and it is not pollinated by the wind. It is pollinated by the insects. Remember, if you are a plant that has showy flowers, it's because you are pollinated by an insect. You want to put it all out there in a showy flower to attract your pollinators. If this is the best you can do in a flower, then you know that this plant is not being pollinated by an insect, it's being pollinated by the wind. So you can see here's what ragweed looks like prior to it having these little stalks. Now, you will see tiny little bees because there is a little yellow spot to the end of each of these openings, and there is nectar in there, and there is pollen in there, but it is not a species that is attractive to our insect pollinators because it doesn't have the showy flower and it doesn't have the amount of nectar that is usable to them as well. So some of the others, Joe Pye, boneset. There are many different cultivars now of Joe Pye weed. They're making what they call Little Joe, so it doesn't get as tall for smaller gardens. And you can check to see. Right now, Doug Ptolemy and a couple of others are doing a lot of research trying to determine how beneficial are the cultivars to our native pollinators. So if we now have Joe Pye weed that's shorter, what's the insect visitation rate on these plants? What what occurred in the breeding? Do we still have the same amount of nectar content? Do we still have the same amount of pollen content on on a plant that has had some changes made to it to either make it a different color or fit it into a different habitat? So that research is ongoing, and I'm sure we'll have some good information, in the coming times ahead. Blazing star, Liatris. There are many different species of Liatris. This Liatris spicata, you can go to Mark's in the spring, and you can buy the bulbs. I don't know what it is, 15 or 18 bulbs for 2.99, and you can plant those, and you can have this Liatris. I mean, it's almost hard to kill Liatris. Okay, it does very well from bulbs. So here's a bit of color that you can add, bring in those pollinating species, things that you don't necessarily find that often. Milbert's tortoiseshell is not a species we see as much up here, but it's a good one. You need to have some stinging nettle for its food plant. Most people aren't going to rush out and buy stinging nettle to plant in their gardens, but it's again, if you want the whole package, you want the eggs, you want the caterpillars, you want the adults, you need to have the food plants for the caterpillars as well as nectaring plants for the adults. And then here's a lot of monarchs on the rough blazing star. Again, a good plant. And as you can see, like we talked about with the others, it starts to open at the top and then it will continue to open as it goes down. So it's not a big flash in the pan of its nectar or its pollen all at one time. So that's why the prolonged blooms of these plants are really key to the pollination game. And then others, tall ironweed, black-eyed Susan, Caryopteris, dark night is one that seems to do better up here. Sometimes this will die back all the way to the ground, but then it'll come up in the spring from the ground. Again, this is another blue plant that blooms late. It's just real pretty. And then think your annuals too. Mexican sunflower, tithonia, the zinnias, the tall verbena, Verbena bonariensis. All three of these bring in all kinds of stuff. I have a nursery near me where I ask her each year to grow me a flat of Mexican sunflower. Most people grow it from seed just fine, but it'll get tall, okay? But it is amazing as an attractive plant to the pollinators. The bumblebees are all over it, the native bees are all over it, the butterflies. One of my first times that I ever saw a giant swallowtail in my yard is because it was nectaring on a tithonia. So I was just really thrilled with that. Um, Again, zinnias are another one of those plants that you can get, at your local nursery. Mark's has it when they have their little flats. And then the verbena here on the end, this is another one that brings in a lot of butterflies, a lot of bees. If you let it go to seed and we don't have a real hard winter, mine will come back from seed. I collect the seed in the winter prior to winter and I save it and then I, plant it again in the spring. But I try to have as much of that plant as I can get because it really brings in a lot. It's got that little tube to the flower. So a lot of our small skippers can be feeding on that as well. So it's a good one for that. And again, don't forget our trees and shrubs, buttonbush, clethra, summer sweet. While that's not necessarily, it's a native to the U.S., clethra is one that can take over an area. But again, you can see how its pollen is out a lot out on the edge with the nectar being down in. But I've got hummingbirds all over my clethra. So it's another one that can bring in the hummingbirds. New Jersey tea, a native plant that was at one time more rare, but now a lot of the nurseries are offering it because it just gets swarms of pollinating and nectaring insects on it when it blooms. So it's a woody. We've got some that's actually native at Singer Lake that's growing on a hillside. But then as the maples grew up and kind of shaded it out, we had to go in and remove some of those trees like that so that the New Jersey teak could thrive. But this is a good one. And then for some of you, I'm sure you've remembered that I have mentioned this Ben Franklin tree. It is a native of the Great Smokies, and it's got this nice large white bloom with just absolutely, it's like the just might as well belly up to the bar with the honeybees and the bumblebees and the carpenter bees. They absolutely love it, and it turns a beautiful scarlet color in the fall. So we know we have a lot of threats to our pollinator species, habitat loss and fragmentation. So say you're a butterfly and you're looking at 200 plus acres of Phragmites and you need to fly over that to try to find a plant to nectar on. It's a big problem. It's not like you're going to get in a car and drive across there. You're a flying insect. So these huge areas of invasive species are basically like you're putting up a wall to these pollinators. Fragmentation is also another one where you're taking a woods or you're taking something and you're putting something right down the middle of it that invites a whole host of other non-native invasive species, cowbirds, things like that, to get into those bigger tracts of forests that are so important to many of these species to lay their eggs on. Off-road vehicle use, um, contamination, spills, aerial spraying, mining, all kinds of things, the removal of natural resources. Sand and gravel operations really take up a huge amount of land and basically lay bare the soil. But, I guess on the good part of that is having a bunch of sand does open it up for the potential of having all of those little species that will nest in sand or in bare ground. But also sometimes if they leave their high walls high enough, bank swallows can come in and nest as well. So I guess there's a little positive there. But we also have our pesticide and herbicide use, which I cannot say enough about. Don't do it. You always kill more than the targeted species. Bees, in particular honeybees, are especially sensitive because their larger surface area relative to their body volume causes the chemicals to be far more deadly. even the carpenter bees, some of the other bigger bees like that really take it on the chin when they get into an herbicide area, pesticide area. If you've got a lot of farms around you and your farmer is spraying with the big tractors and the big spray units, and you've got insects flying through the residual spray that's flying up as they are laying it down, that's like an instant death knell for them. So this is all very, very difficult. Again, for alternatives, choose native plants to cut down on the diseases and the chemical use. Encourage naturally occurring biological controls, which means do not order mantis egg cases because you're going to get either European or Chinese mantises, and you're just taking that predator and sticking them back out into your flower beds. Also, don't get the little containers that you can get of lady beetles because they're going to send you Asian lady beetles, which can have a lot of different looks to them, but they're still Asian lady beetles. They eat a lot of our other species that are native, in addition to eating, for example, our non-native mantises spend a good bit of their time eating our native mantises, which is the Carolina mantis. I haven't seen a Carolina mantis in northern Ohio in forever. It's more found in the southern part of the state, and it's a lot smaller, so it becomes a prey item. The Asian lady beetles are the ones that come into your window wells and that in the fall so that they can spend the winter in your house and stay nice and warm. And then they're the ones that, if they land on you, they can bite you. So, not the best. And again, you want to minimize the competition of these non native insects to our native insects. And, if you can hand pick them or crush them, or use a soapy water solution and just pick them and put them in the soapy water solution. That's also another way of trying to get rid of them. So here's our palette. This is our black swallowtail hind wings, showing those little eye spots that can sometimes fool birds to go after the hind wing thinking it's a face rather than going after the real part of the face and potentially killing the butterfly. But if you've got all the pieces parts, if you've got the food plants for the caterpillars and you've got the nectar plants for the adults, here's that common buckeye caterpillar. Here's the adult. Um, for me, the common buckeye eats a lot of different weed plants that are in my yard, and it's a gorgeous, gorgeous caterpillar. So again, it's not like you need a lot of really specific things for some of these species, but some of the species do require very specific food plants. Here's the Viceroy caterpillar down at the bottom. It's one of our caterpillars that look like bird poop, because if you look like bird poop, you're not likely to be eaten by a bird. So having these white patches interspersed with these little green patches, willows are one of the best that you can have for a lot of different butterfly and moth species as a food plant. And you can see that it's just chewing its way down this willow leaf as it's going to make its way and go on to the next one. And then here's our Viceroy adult. So again, to having the whole pieces parts is good. Bringing in all these different species. These are all species that I've taken pictures of in my yard because I have been planting for years and adding things for years, trying to get as much diversity as I can. So here's that morning cloak with its little tongue rolled up here. Peck skipper on our pink clover. Cecropia moths, while those saturnid moths, those larger moths, do not feed. They have no mouth parts. So they're only alive for about 12 to 14 days. Once they hatch out, they need to find a mate. They need to do their thing. They need to lay eggs because they're not going to be around for much longer. They are not necessarily a pollinating moth. However, if they do crawl across plants, they're out at night. So typically they are laying their eggs in tree species, but they can be an incidental pollinator per se. Here's our tiger swallowtail caterpillar. It's actually feeding on a magnolia. Our dagger moths that have these great little hairy bodies. And then here's our spice bush swallowtail in the fall, just before it gets ready to make its chrysalis. It turns orange to kind of blend in with the dropping leaves. And it's got that little snake looking face on it to potentially thwart a bird predator from, eating it,
All
gobbling
right,
it up.
Judy, I hate
Yes.
to cut you off, but we are
Okay.
approaching 8:30 and
Okay.
have some questions here.
Okay,
Um,
I got like 2 slides left. I just want to put up the one slide that is
okay,
the resource slide. So
okay.
just more beautiful caterpillars. Everything is all connected. So think about what you're doing in your yard. It's all connected. So if you're using pesticides or those kinds of things, it's going to find its way to other places where you don't want it. This was the literary resource, and I could send this slide out if people want it. I could send it to you, Suzanne, if you want to put that in something that goes to the folks. So
Yep,
I
we
am
post it all on the OSU page for the pollinator series. So yep, that'd be great.
great.
Send it to
All
me.
right, I'm ready for questions.
All right. So first and foremost, everybody wants to know, your pictures are amazing. What type of camera lens or camera have you been using for these pictures?
Well, there have been different ones over the years. I do not have very expensive camera equipment at all. I have a Canon. A lot of these were shot with a Canon Rebel back in the day, and I had a ring light for some of the close-up ones. Right now, I have a point and shoot with a fixed lens that I use for some of these other pictures. So a good quality camera. The mechanics of cameras nowadays are far better than back when I first started taking pictures. So there's more megapixels, there's a lot more clarity to the shots. So I've used Canon, and then this other little point and shoot is a little Nikon.
Awesome. And if you guys have questions, I please encourage you to use the chat or the Q&A function down on the bottom. And I see them and I will ask them. So Linda wants to know, what pollinates witch hazel?
Ah, there are several. So that's a good one because witch hazel comes out, obviously stays out late. I have seen flies. I've seen some tiny, tiny little beetles on witch hazel. But again, a lot of our insects are can be done at the time that witch hazel is blooming. So some of the we do have actually some non-native species that actually take longer before they either go into the ground or die because they're from areas where the temperatures are colder. So I do know that there are some fly species that I have seen on witch hazel and some tiny little beetles.
And deer flies. Catherine thought they drank blood, but you say they're also a pollinator?
Well, again, a lot of they do. They come around you, they bite you, you carry your friendly neighborhood dragonfly with you so that the dragonfly can pull them out and eat them. But yeah, believe it or not, some of these fly species, even horseflies, while they're focusing on trying to get to a person to get blood, remember that they can feed on nectar. So if they're feeding on some nectar, they will also then. I've seen deer flies on plants actually crawling across, and then when something comes near them where it might be, actual blood that they can get to, then they can fly off and try to find that as well. So I've had deer flies on plants.
Okay, and also Yvette told me that the chat was disabled. So if you're having problems,
Ah,
please use the Q&A because it's coming through. But she thought you did a great job.
thank you.
And let's see, Lorna wants to know if flies pollinate vegetables, or are there any that do?
There are, well, there's a variety depending on the vegetable. For example, uh, zucchini and those types of plants are pollinated by these little squash bees that actually will stay in the flower during the night. So there are a lot of different species that go directly with garden vegetables. What I do in my vegetable garden is I plant borage around the herb borage around the outside of my vegetable garden because borage brings in a lot of different little bees and flies that will then move on to the other plants that might be in your garden.
Okay, and what is the larval food plant for the hummingbird sphinx moth?
Um, there are some, I believe grape is one of them. And I'm trying to think of what else I've seen them on. That's the biggest one that I've seen them on. It's like wild grape, or the time I see them most often on that. Um, I'd have to look and see what else might be for that. It's a real cool caterpillar too.
So what can Joshua wants to know what he can plant as an alternative to lawn grass that's beneficial and can also be walked on. So something low and thick.
Okay, so go on the so if you're familiar with the native plant nursery in Hiram, um, it now goes by its initials instead of the, and I'll think of it here in a second. Go on their website. They have a lawn grass mix that is actually got clover, um, and other low growing plants that bring in pollinators. And actually, all the clovers add a lot of nutrients to the soil as well. Oh gosh, I can't think of it. Just left me just that quick, but I'll think of it. But
OPN.
what is it?
Is it
OPN.
OPN?
Yes, Ohio Prairie Nursery. Thank you, whoever might have thought of that.
It was Reese
um,
and Lynn.
Good job. Thank you. They have, go on their website, they have this seed mixture that is specifically put together to relieve yourself of lawn grass. So, depending on where you might have grasses, you can also do things like some mosses, things like that, that may be in more of a cooler type habitat. Like I said, I leave all my clovers, both the white and the pink, going. And even if I don't mow for a while, it's not like clover gets, really horribly tall. I refrain from mowing, or I'll mow around patches of clover just to leave it. But they will list the species that are in that mix. So check it out on OPN. That's something new that they're offering, and it's been very successful.
Let's see. Patty and Cheryl and Connie said thank you. This was very informative. Oh, and Peggy and Jane as well. So
Great.
kudos.
And
Matt says the great golden digger wasp create tunnels every year at the edge of his sand ring where his wife exercises her horse.
yeah,
It's so much fun to watch. The grandkids enjoy it.
that's actually a really cool species that you don't see often, because you really do need to have that sand. That's same thing a lot of times with you if you get cicada killers. They also like those sand. It's a big wasp. They're not interested in people. They're just interested in doing their thing.
A couple more. Do Mark's flowers have neonicotinoids? So big box stores like Mark's or Home Depot or Lowe's, do they generally use neonicotinoids?
So you need to do some research. So the other thing that I suggest that you do is go on the LEAP, LEAP bio.org website. And there is a link to a interactive map, and it shows all the native plant nurseries in the area, in the Northeast Ohio area. So you can click on a little number, and it tells you the place and the phone number and the hours and all that good stuff. But you can go directly to those places to get your plants. We have been working for years with LEAP, which is the Lake Erie Allegheny Partnership, and have been working with the box stores such as Lowe's and that, to not have them carry those types of plants, and to not have them carry the non-native invasive plants. So they are doing better. But I do know that a lot of the places where Marks gets their plants are nurseries here in Ohio. And so I do know that some of those do not have that, they're not treated in that manner.
Okay.
So you can do some research, and the more the nursery finds out that people do not want to purchase plants that have been subjected to that, then that's the way money talks, and that's the way that they might change the way they do things.
Awesome. So what's a practical way to provide small amounts of water at ground level for all temperatures?
So what you could do is the those clay pots, the bigger clay pots that might have a saucer to the pot, or even the plastic pots. So they might be maybe 2 feet across, or 18 inches across, or 12 inches across. You could just dig a little hole and put that in the ground, put some sand in it, and then put like a bird bath heater in it. So you can have it near the house and plug it in near the house. And that really, really helps. And during the rest of the season where you don't have to worry about ice, do the same thing with those plant saucers and spread them around your yard. Put them in a bunch of different places. And then that way, just put new water in them with your sprinkling can each day, if you know, if they need it. And you will find that all kinds of things will use it. I've had people tell me that they've set up their trail cameras near where they provide water, and they get all kinds of shots knowing that things are using them during the night. And certainly the insects will love you for it as well, especially if you can have a transition between actual standing water and then a sandy bank to it. Some people use those boot trays that you can buy, like at a Walmart or one of those stores that might be about 2 inches. They have a little edging around them. Sometimes they'll put a boot tray out, lay it flat, and then fill that with water, and then put some rocks in it, and the birds can go in and take a bath because it's a bigger area that you can have water, standing water in it.
Awesome. Lori and Daniel said amazing photography, great presentation. And Karen has the last question I see. Again, sorry about the chat. I don't know what happened there.
Yeah.
If you have a last minute question, I know some of you had raised your hands. Please get it in the Q&A. But Karen says, can we create a place for native bees to nest, that is, build a hill against the foundation of the house using sandy soil?
Absolutely. Anything like that, you could do the same thing with if you have any outbuildings. The other thing you can do is stack up. It also helps to have like a wood pile stack that you're not going to burn through, because you can also take sand and put it up against a wood pile, so that not only will you have insects going into the wood pile, but you may also have the bees using that area to be able to get in between the logs. Or even if you have a bunch of sticks and you want to make a stick pile, that's also good for a lot of those insects to climb in, spend the winter. uh, I have a wood pile that I've actually used for, I've got a drill bit and I've made holes in the wood that I know I'm not going to burn. And every year I have a variety of insects using those little holes. So yes, you can do that. You absolutely can bank the soil or make an area of soil that has got some depth to it, because they will crawl down and excavate. You can actually make that in your yard if you want, and dig an area that might be 3 feet square or whatever, and have 6 to 8 inches of sand in there, and just keep it sort of grass free, and that will help out as well.
All right, Judy.